Okay, guys. Thank you all so much for coming. This is the first in the Sweet Briar College Creative Writing Series. It's put on by Lectures and Events. So thank you, Lectures and Events. There will be refreshments after Jane's talk in the lobby. And there will also be books available for sale, which you can buy out there, and which Jane is perfectly willing to sign right here. So to kind of divide up the crowds. What else? Okay, so stay tuned for the next event in the reading series. That will be announced shortly. And I want to give a shout out to the other people in my department. Mr. John Castine, Mr. John Gregory Brown. Where's Jeff Martin? There's Jeff Martin. Jeff Martin. And then Carrie Brown, who's like an honorary member of the department, and has been a member of the department. So there she is. Thank you guys. You guys have been invaluable in helping me organize this. Whew. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Savannah Klein, who's going to introduce Jane Smiley. Savannah is a junior. She is a creative writing and environmental studies major and a horse lover. And Jane this morning met the horse, Spike, that Savannah works with. So I am going to turn it over to Savannah now.
A young adult horse series and a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel. Together, an unlikely combination, but add that to 2 biographies, a mystery, a memoir, a satire, a collection of short stories, and a plethora of novels, and you begin to understand the depth and breadth of Jane Smiley's works. For me, Smiley's versatility is not only impressive, but also a little comforting, as it shows that being a writer doesn't necessarily mean being stuck in a given genre. Of course, the brilliance of Smiley isn't that she's simply versatile, it's that she is successful. It does not matter what genre or form Smiley wrangles into her work. Her gifts as a writer shine through, namely, keen insight into human emotions and graceful prose that subtly wraps around readers and then holds them fast to the raw or witty or uncomfortable or familiar within the work. While reading Smiley's novel Private Life, which impressively captures over 6 decades of Margaret Mayfield's life, I was in awe of Smiley's ability to not only carry a compelling story over so many years, but also seamlessly work time and place into the plot. Take, for example, this beautiful moment where Margaret and her soon-to-be husband, Captain Andrew Jackson Early, are walking around the Louisiana Purchase Exposition and the electrical lights come to life. And Margaret did think, just then, that if it was meant for a man and a woman to share something with each other that they did not share with anyone else, then somehow, for Captain Early and herself, this was it. The strange effervescence of the impending 20th century, of bright light beginning in one place and instantly being in another place in a way that you did not sense with a candle or even a star. The incredible sense of hope that is created within this single sentence is one of my favorite things about Smiley's writing. But if she's good at creating hope, then she's a master at destroying it. The tragedies that befall some of her characters strike in the gut, and sometimes don't leave you for days. I, and I'm sure many others of you, found this particularly true for her novel, 1,000 Acres, which portrays chilling family turmoil set against the unquestionably flat Iowa landscape. 1,000 Acres is the novel that won Smiley the Pulitzer Prize in 1992. In 2001, she was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and in 2006, she received the PEN USA Lifetime Achievement Award for Literature. Tonight, Smiley will be reading from her forthcoming novel, Some Luck, which is the first in a trilogy and will be released by Knopf in October. She will also be talking about her approach to her craft, and we hope sharing some of her insight into the animals that she and much of the Sweet Briar community care so much about, horses. Please join me in welcoming Jane Smiley.
Thank you. That was really wonderful. Can I have a blurb? I thought that was great. So if I start coughing, I have the Ricola, and I'm going to read a bunch of stuff. I thought it would be fun to dip into various things. And so I'm going to read from 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel, because some of you are students and you're trapped here and you can't get out. And I'm going to read from A Year at the Races as an example of nonfiction. And I'm going to read 2 sections from Some Luck, which comes out on October 7th. So a couple of weeks. And I just saw on my phone, I can't believe this, but it was just long-listed for the National Book Award. Now, why they would long-list a book that hasn't been published yet, but I ain't complaining. That's very exciting, and Martin Amis wasn't, so I guess he's the big gun. So, and then I'm also going to read, one of the passages I'm going to read in here is a little equestrian passage. And then I also am going to read another equestrian passage from volume 2, which I have on my Kindle, which is in production right now. So I'll start with 13 Ways. And this is from chapter 3, called Who is a Novelist? This is for you students. The epigraph is by Marcel Proust. I had not then read any real novels. I had heard it said that George Sand was a typical novelist. That had prepared me in advance to imagine that François Lachamp contained something inexpressibly delicious. That's from Swan's Way. A novel has an author. I want to tell you right now that I have read all of In Search of Lost Time. And I want I want you to raise your hand if you have read all of In Search of Lost Time. There is one. I am so glad. Is there 2? Is that you 2? No, not you. So thank you. I'm glad you're here. When I was on the BBC in the spring, and there was an English woman reader, an English scholar, a French woman who phoned in, and me. And at one point, it was all about Proust, and at one point they asked, who had read In Search of Lost Time. And the French woman said that in France, everybody in the educated classes says that they have read In Search of Lost Time, all of it. And the English professor said that in England, Francophiles say that they have read all of In Search of Lost Time. And I said, when I finished, I called everybody I knew, including very famous people. And I said, have you read In Search of Lost Time? And they all said no. So I said, in America, nobody even cares. So you don't have to lie about it the way you have to do in France and England. Anyway, a novel has an author. The desire to write a novel is the single required prerequisite for writing a novel. It is the only thing that overcomes all the handicaps: perfectionism, low self-esteem, depression, alcoholism, diseases of all kinds, immense riches, economic hardship, deadly enemies, the resistance of relatives and friends, laziness, retarded professional development, the regular responsibilities of adulthood, and even imprisonment. While the desire to write a novel does not guarantee that the resulting novel will be a good one, or if it is, that the author will produce a string of good ones, It is the only way to begin. Most often it grows out of a compulsive habit of reading as a child. It was said of Sinclair Lewis that he was always doing two things at once, and one of them was reading a book. Charles Dickens was an avid reader as a boy. His dearest childhood memories were of reading the tales of the Arabian Nights. I read in preference to almost every other activity, though I did not read anything respectable. I liked the Bobbsey twins and Nancy Drew. The Brontes, living in a solitary Yorkshire parsonage with a very eccentric father, not only read compulsively, but also wrote compulsively, and had composed many hundreds of pages by their late teens. Undoubtedly, we were reading for all the wrong reasons. Escape, pleasure, avoidance of responsibilities and human contact. We were reading because it was easy and fun and because we were unsupervised. We were reading to find companions more congenial than those around us. We wanted to fill our heads with nonsense and tune out practical considerations. We were not most likely athletic or useful sorts of children. We were reluctant to help around the house or go outside and play. We did not have very good manners because in numerous ways to be cited later, reading books is deleterious to good manners. We did not have good sleep habits because if we had, we would not have read under the bed covers with a flashlight or held the book up to the moon that shone through the window and ruined our eyes. We were reading because we had two lives, an inner life and an outer life, and they were equally important to us and equally vivid. A novelist is someone whose inner experience is as compelling as the details of his or her life, someone who may owe more to another author never met than to a close relative seen every day. A novelist has two lives, a reading life and a writing life, and a reading and writing life and a lived life. He or she cannot be understood at all apart from this. From our habit of reading, we unconsciously imbibed hundreds of character portrayals, thousands of word usages and sentence structures, thousands of metaphors, similes, and circumlocutions. We saw countless motives analyzed, innumerable behaviors described. We followed plot after plot, from exposition to denouement. In assuaging our loneliness or our boredom, we also learned what it took to make a novel, though most of us didn't try it at first. We were interested in content, but the intuitive knowledge of form entered along with the content and became part of our mental furniture. A good example of this process for me was my love of Sherlock Holmes, and in particular, my frequent rereading of The Hound of the Baskervilles. And I think when they make that movie, John, your dog should be the Hound of the Baskervilles. You can put a little coat on him, you know, a little sparkle. He's the one. Call Central Casting. Okay, so this book is about the history and the anatomy of the novel, which I started it around 9/11. I wanted to read something. After 9/11, I wanted to read something that was completely divorced from a modern life, and so I picked up the tale of Genji, which had been written in the year 1004, thereabouts. And guess what? They talk about all the time in the tale of Genji is the ephemerality of life. I said, come on, you guys, let's read something different. So I went back to the Icelandic sagas. Well, what did they talk about in the Icelandic sagas? Death, feuds, battles, people, you know, cutting other people's guts open and their guts spilling out, and then the guy taking his stomach, you know, taking his, I think it was his clothing in his mouth so that he could put the guts back in. Icelandic sagas, that's what you want to read. And then I got to Boccaccio, the Decameron, and what are they talking about but the Black Death? You know, I thought, will these people never, ever stop talking about the same thing? And the answer was no. And so I read 130 or so novels from 1000 to 2000 in publication dates. And I discovered that they shared some very interesting qualities. And they were also quite idiosyncratic in many ways. And so I loved them. And the main thing I decided was there is no greatest one. They're all so individual that you can't make a hierarchy out of the novel. You can just enjoy them when you get the chance. So I'm going to read a little bit from Some Luck. Some Luck, I came up with the idea, so what is it, 2014? I would say about 5 years ago. I decided I wanted to write a trilogy called The Last 100 Years. And I wanted it to start in 1920 and end in 2019. And I went about it in a sort of cerebral way. I thought, okay, if I'm going to write about the last 100 years of American history, where am I going to start it? And I thought, okay, what is the most telling thing about any culture? And that is how they get their food. So I went back to the farm. I found myself a spot in Iowa, not quite the same as Thousand Acres. Thousand Acres is a little bit north central, and this spot is more central. And I came up with 5 characters. I put them on the farm. And, 7 characters, because there's a couple who owns the farm. They're the mother and the father. And then there are 5 children. And then as they move forward through the 20th century and into the 21st century, they have their children, and their children have children. And then there's eventually some great-grandchildren, too. And it moves forward year by year. Every chapter is a new year. And so that was a pleasure because I was taking the stories of their lives and sort of weaving them into the progression of time rather than allowing the stories to be self-contained. And I didn't know how that would work out because I didn't know anybody else who had tried that. But it worked out in a quite interesting way for me because it picked up energy as it went along, One thing I really, really, really wanted to do was follow, I guess this is a sign of old age, but I wanted to follow my characters, or at least some of them, from birth to death, and just see how their beings, how their inner lives and their lives in general evolved from beginning to end. So that happens with several of the characters, and that was quite interesting for me. So I'm going to read a scene from the end of 1921. So Frank is the firstborn. He's born on January 1st, 1920. His father's named Walter. He's the guy who bought the farmer. His father is a local farmer who's pretty prosperous. Walter's wife is Rosanna. Walter was born in 1895. Rosanna was born in 1900. Walter's background is English farmers who came to America. Rosanna's background is German farmers who came to America. They live in a small town in central Iowa. And I would say at this point they've been married. When Frank was born, they'd probably been married about a year. So this is the end of 1921. It's a very short scene, but it's the first equestrian scene, so I wanted to read it. "He isn't yet 2, said Mama, holding him a little more tightly. "Ah, he'll like it," said Papa. "Never saw a nicer horse than Jake. You've been on him, I've been on him. Here, Eloise, climb on the feed trough there and show Rosanna." Eloise is Rosanna's sister. She's about 14. It was dim in the long barn, but arrows and sparkles of light pierced the dark walls here and there. Frank knew what the beings were in their separate enclosures. Cows going in and out over there, white sheep with black faces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a rooster perched on the beam above them, and this greatest of beings, Jake the horse, pale gray, almost white, who now turned his nose and eyes toward Frank and made noise. Frank laughed. Eloise said, "I have a dress on." "You're wearing your long johns, aren't you? He's clean. I brushed him before you came out." They all walked with Jake across some of the dark earth to a place, and then Eloise climbed, and then Papa helped her, and soon she was sitting on the back of Jake, holding his hair, and then Papa put his hands around Frank and lifted him high in the air, and he kicked his legs, and then he was set upon Jake's back, just in front of Eloise, and Eloise put her arm tight around him. "Oh, goodness," said Mama. "Well, that is cute in spite of everything." "I was riding my father's Percherons out to the pasture when I was 3, said Walter. "Now, he did not let me ride Uncle Leon's Clydesdales, but the Percheron." Underneath Frank, the warm, rounded gray surface rippled and moved, and Eloise took both of his hands in hers and put them into the hair and said, "Hold on, Frankie." And so he gripped that hair. He could feel her through his suit, hard against his back and shoulders. In front of him rose a monumental gray shape that ended in 2 points, and then the gray shape shifted, and they were moving forward. Frank loved moving forward. Didn't matter, wagon, buggy, cultivator. He threw his arms into the air, but Eloise was still holding him. Papa's head stayed right there in front of him as the horse moved. But when he turned to look at her, he saw that Mama was smaller, her hands on her hips. All the animals stared, the sheep and the cows and the other horse. The rooster flew down from his perch, lifting his wings and making a squawk. "Good boy," said Papa. Excuse me. So, Frank is what you might call a very contrary child. I think he would say he's simply self-directed. And he, the next part I'm going to read is around the time that he starts school in the neighborhood schoolhouse. So, this is 1927. So Frank's about, he would have just turned 7, I guess. Now that it was January and Frank was going to school every day, even in the snow and the cold, he understood many things better than he had. And it wasn't only ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. First thing he understood was that he was taller than the other 7-year-old boy, Luke Caston. Luke understood that too and stayed out of his way. He was also taller than the 8-year-old and one of the 9-year-olds, Donald Guthrie and Matthew Graham. The rest of the boys, 5 in number, were taller than he was and stronger, but not as smart. A couple of the big ones could hardly read, which perplexed Frank a bit, since reading was the easiest thing in the world. There were 7 girls in the school, all older. The nicest one was Minnie Frederick, who lived near them and was 8. She sometimes held his hand if any of the boys happened to bully him. She would say, "Oh, Frankie, forget them, they're stupid." But Frank wasn't about to forget a thing. No siree, as his Uncle Rolf would say. So far, since school started in September, the boys had done 6 things to him. Lured him into the coal shed and locked the door on him, peeked at him in the privy, stolen his coat and kept it for the entire very rainy day, splashed mud on him by stomping in a puddle, kicked him, poured dirt down the back of his pants. It wasn't as though Frank was the only victim. The big boys had done 10 things to Luke Caston, 9 things to Matthew Graham, and 6 things to Donald Guthrie. Maybe those boys were not keeping track, but Frank was, because keeping track was easy for him. Wasn't he already doing multiplication? And as for Miss Jenkins, the teacher, she was always peering at them the way Irma had done before Irma got her glasses. So Frank was pretty sure that she couldn't see much of anything. Maybe like Irma, she didn't know she needed glasses. What Irma said was, "Leaves, birds, I never saw any of that before." Or maybe she didn't have the money. Glasses were expensive, according to Mama, who told Irma that if she lost hers, she didn't know how they were going to afford another pair. Anyway, the boys who couldn't be seen in the back rows or at the far end of the schoolyard were getting up to plenty of trouble, climbing the trees, pelting each other with acorns and worse. And then today, at the end of recess, when Frank was just standing there, Bobby Dugan and Howie Prince had run up to him, pushed him flat on his back, rubbed his face with snow, and run away laughing. Frank was keeping track. Aside from Minnie Frederick, two of the girls were nothing much to look at. Two were big and imposing. They reminded him of Eloise. And two were very pretty. One of these was Alice Canham, and the other was her sister, Marie. Alice was 9 and never looked at him. Marie was 10 and thought he was a pest. The only pretty girl who liked him was Minnie, but she liked him a lot. Her father's farm was on his way to school, big, 300 acres, and paid off. Frank had heard Mama and Papa talk all about the Frederick place, but the Fredericks were Quakers, so they didn't visit much back and forth. But that was a great thing to say what Papa said, free and clear. And Minnie's ma was known all over for her baking. All the farm ladies were proud of their baking, but Mrs. Frederick tried special things, not just bread and pies and pound cake, but drop donuts and cookies that Minnie brought to school and shared. When Minnie had a birthday in November, her mama sent a checkerboard cake where all the slices were laid out on the plate like a checkerboard, chocolate and white. Frank thought that this was wonderfully luxurious, but it was just the sort of thing that Mama did not have time for, and Granny Mary and Granny Elizabeth thought was silly. And so Frank was friends with Minnie, also because Minnie held up her head and stabbed those big boys with her always sharpened pencils if they gave her any trouble. Frank stood up, brushed the snow off as best he could, and made his way toward the schoolhouse door where Mrs. Jenkins was ringing the bell. She peered at him as he came toward her, then said, "Young Frank, best to develop a habit of promptitude early in your life. You'll never regret it." As he entered the school door, she followed right behind him, but she didn't say a word about the snow and water dripping off his backside. All through reading and arithmetic, and then when they ate their lunches and progressed through singing and spelling, Frank dried without once shivering and pondered his plan. This was episode 4 for Bobby Dugan and episode 3 for Howie Prince, and that was just counting what they'd done to him. All told, Bobby went after someone or other once or twice a week, and Howie helped him at least half those times. Bobby most often helped an even bigger boy, Dallas Coggins. The good thing was that Frank sat behind Bobby and could watch him without being noticed. He could also see into his desk whenever Bobby opened it. It was a mess in there, but looking in there gave Frank a perfect idea, and an easy one, too. When he got home from school, it was still light. Mama was walking back and forth in the front room with Lillian in her arms, watching for him out the window, as she did every afternoon. He only had to walk a quarter mile on his own, and that was on the road. From the schoolhouse, he stepped onto the porch. Mama set Lillian in her downstairs cradle, opened the front door, and helped him off with his boots. Joe came out of the kitchen. Joe's 2 years younger, his thumb in his mouth, but didn't say anything. No, he did not want anything to eat. Yes, he'd had a good day at school. Frank knew he couldn't express any desire to go to the barn or even to go upstairs. Mama was suspicious of his motives at all times. She said, "You carry your coat through the house and hang it in the back hall, Frankie." It was when he was doing this that he saw it, one he had forgotten, a nice-sized mousetrap, big enough to hurt but small enough to go into the desk in a dark corner. He looked at it, but he didn't touch it because Joey was right behind him. Joey had a way of sensing that Frank was up to something, so for the rest of the evening when Frank was in the house, Joe was right beside him. Frank didn't look for other traps when he was out helping Papa and Ragnar with the cows and the horses and the sheep, but the traps he saw were too big. He could just tell by looking that he wouldn't be able to hide one of them in Bobby's desk. Papa wouldn't let him out of his sight either, just like the others. Frank was patient. Nobody thought he was patient. Someone was always saying, "Hold your horses, Frankie." But he had stores and stores of patience. They could not understand if there was something he really, really, really wanted to do. It was when he was getting ready in the morning for his walk to school that he managed to kick the mousetrap very gently with his toe. It snapped, the bait jumped, and Frank slipped it into his pocket. He could feel it. The edge of the trap was sharp, and the spring, he could tell by the way it snapped, was a good one. He buttoned his coat, went out onto the porch for his boots, then put on his hat and mittens. Mama stood just inside the door, holding Lillian and keeping out of the wind. She kissed him goodbye. The last thing she did was look right at him and say, "If you've got some mischief in your head, young man, get rid of it." Frank returned her gaze and shook his head. Then he said, "I'm good, Mama. Miss Jenkins played the piano yesterday and let me sing all the verses by myself. Everyone else did the chorus." "Well, stay good then," said Mama, before slamming the door. But even after she went inside, he didn't put his hand in his pocket. At Minnie's, Mrs. Frederick gave him a sugared donut to keep him warm, and they trotted onward to the Graham farm. It was cold enough so that the snow was hard, but not that cold. Minnie didn't try to hold his hand. Frank was not sure she had seen him get pushed down the day before. He decided that he had to keep quiet, but not strangely quiet, and he did. He spoke when spoken to and did what he was told, and when something the other boys thought was funny happened, he laughed with them. Already, after only 4 months of school, he saw that if you didn't laugh when the others laughed, they hated you all the more. So he was required to laugh when Bobby tripped Alice Canham as she was making her way back from the pencil sharpener. Right after lunch, he had a moment alone in the classroom during which he set the trap and placed it in his own desk, ready for business. The problem was that Miss Jenkins lined them up and herded them everywhere, into the classroom in the morning, out for recess, back in, back out, back in, then dressed and out the door for home. Yes, she couldn't see much, but she would see him go into Bobby's desk. That night, Frank lay awake in his bed next to Joey, trying to think of something, but he fell asleep. He had never paid much attention to Bobby Dugan. He'd only tried to stay out of his way, but now he watched him carefully. The first thing he saw was that Bobby rolled and smoked a cigarette with Dallas and Howie during recess out by the corner of the schoolyard. They did it again after eating their lunches. Frank didn't know anyone who smoked. He also saw Bobby go into the privy and come out after spending a long time in there. When Frank went into the privy sometime later, he stayed long enough to look all around. He stood on the seat, on his tiptoes, reached up, felt where the roof came down to meet the wall. He found the box of tobacco and matches, pushed to the back of the space there. First thing in the morning when he got to school, he went up to Miss Jenkins and whispered that he wasn't feeling well and might have to go to the privy. Since it was a very cold day, could he keep his coat on in class? Miss Jenkins felt his head, and Frank said, "Mama says I don't have a fever." "No, you don't. Well, we'll see how you feel. If you need to go home at lunchtime, we'll see." When Miss Jenkins had some older kids at the reading table, Frank slipped the mousetrap into his pocket. Then he huddled at his desk for the first hour, all through geography. Just at the right moment, he thought, he staggered out of the room and headed for the privy. He went in and closed the door. He climbed on the seat, carefully set the trap, and placed it on the box of tobacco, a little pushed back. He coughed a few times, and once back in the schoolroom, staggered to his seat. In the next half hour, he revived. By lunchtime, he had removed his coat and hung it on the hook. After lunch, it worked perfectly. Dallas stole Leona Graham's cookie, and instead of eating it, crushed it under his toe in the snow, laughing. Then he, Howie, and Bobby set off for their spot, even though Miss Jenkins called after them. Bobby headed toward the privy on the way. Sure enough, moments after he disappeared, Frank heard a yelp and then some bad words. Miss Jenkins went to the door of the privy, and when Bobby came out with his fingers in his mouth, she said that she would have to make a report to his father. Then she saw the box in his hand and held out her own. He reluctantly gave it to her. She opened it and saw the papers and the tobacco. She started shaking her head. After that, Bobby didn't come to school for a month. Minnie told him that Bobby's dad had him cleaning hog pens the whole time. So Frank is an observant guy, and he spends his entire life being an observant guy. He goes to the war, and he becomes a sniper, so there's stuff about that. Oh, I do want to read. So I wrote there's several equestrian scenes in this book. And this one takes place in volume 2. And in this one, Debbie is the daughter of Lillian, who Rosanna was carrying when she was sending Frank off to school. She's the oldest daughter. She's born in I think she was born in 48. And she is now, it's now about 1962. And so she's about, it's about 1960. So she's about 11 or 12. And the only thing she wants in life is a horse. So I figured I'd read this one because we can all sympathize with the poor child. Her mother and father could not afford to buy her a horse. No plan or scheme that Debbie had managed to come up with, including sending Uncle Frank and Aunt Andy a letter asking very respectfully for a loan of $1,000 to be paid back in 10 years at 5% interest, had worked. But now that Debbie had met Fiona Cannon, who was a year ahead of her at school, she didn't care about a horse of her own. Fiona had 2 horses, or rather a horse, Prince, and a pony, Rufus, and riding with Fiona was far more fun than any camp or lesson she had ever experienced. She rode Rufus, who was a pinto and very low to the ground. She had fallen off Rufus dozens of times. She was expected to fall off Rufus. She was also expected to watch Fiona, who rode Prince. Debbie knew the expression, he rode rings around her, but she had no idea that it was so much fun to have rings ridden around her. Fiona lived 3 stops further on the school bus. She was an only child, and she kept Rufus and Prince at home, but home was not a fancy place with a stable and a riding ring. Home was a 2-story house with a wraparound porch down by the road and a big fenced field out back that dipped and then ran up the hillside and ended at the trees. Rufus and Prince lived together in the field, and all of Fiona's equipment and tack was stored in the garage. Fiona's mom was a teacher at the high school, and her dad had a diner in town that served breakfast and lunch, but not dinner. Debbie had been there. She liked the waffles. When Fiona invited her, not every day, but lots of days, Timmy, that's her older brother, was supposed to tell Mom that she was going to Fiona's, and most times he did. They dropped their books inside the house, changed clothes. She was just a little shorter and thinner than Fiona, and went out back where Fiona stood at the gate with a bucket of oats and a lead rope, smacking the chain of the lead rope against the bucket and shouting, "Come in, come in." And then the best thing happened. Prince and Rufus came galloping down the hill exactly as if they were happy to see them. Fiona, of course, but also Debbie, it seemed. While Prince ate from the bucket, Debbie fed a couple of handfuls to Rufus. Then they brushed them and picked their hooves. Debbie stood Rufus up next to the fence and clambered on. He was slick beneath her, so she entwined the fingers of one hand in his mane and gripped the lead rope with the other. Fiona eased onto Prince and sat there, limber and relaxed, until Debbie felt secure. Then she clapped her legs against his sides and headed diagonally up the hill in a big walk. Rufus jogged a little to keep up. Prince was a beautiful horse, a thoroughbred who had raced at Pimlico. He was a chestnut. Debbie mouthed the word, chestnut, with a blaze and 2 white feet. As far as Debbie could tell, Fiona could do anything on a horse. It was not only jumping and fox hunting. In Virginia, lots of people did that. Fiona could do some things that you only saw in the movies, like slide to one side and show her face under Prince's neck at a canter, and then pull herself back into the saddle. She could also ride backwards, jump off at the trot and a canter, and get Prince to turn, stop, and back up without any bridle at all. Debbie wasn't sure what Fiona saw in her, They weren't special friends at school. Debbie was in a group of 7th graders who took Latin instead of French and thought serving on the student council was important. Most of them didn't even know who Fiona was, but in the fall at the bus stand, Fiona had overheard Debbie say to one girl that she was going to have a set of riding lessons, and then she had started talking to her that afternoon. The next day, she invited Debbie to meet Prince and Rufus, which was, of course, fine with Mom, who thought that Debbie did not need to copy her homework over twice just to make sure every word was perfect. At the fence, they turned to the right. The dip was below them, and the hillside stretched damp and green before them. All along the fence to their left, the dogwoods were blooming against the darker background of the not yet leafy trees, and there were a few bluebells. In the fall, they had picked blackberries at the top of the hill, right from the backs of their horses, while the horses ate grass. Today, they walked along the fence about halfway up the slope. Then Fiona said, "Stop a minute and watch this." Debbie pulled on Rufus's lead rope, and Rufus halted. Fiona trotted on up the hillside for another 10 or 15 feet, then turned Prince, and still trotting, she squatted on his back. And then she stood up. After a few strides, she dropped the lead rope and jumped into the air, bending her knees. He trotted out from under her. She landed on her feet. Debbie clapped, and Fiona gave a little bow. She pulled a piece of carrot out of her pocket and called, "Prince, come in." Prince looped a lazy circle, then took some bites of grass, but after thinking about it for a moment, he ambled up the hill and received his carrot. Rufus wanted a piece too. Fiona gave him a tiny bit, then said, "I started doing that over the weekend. I want to try it at the canner." Debbie had learned to sit calmly on Rufus and say, "That would be fun." What Fiona saw in her was a mystery, unless it was that whatever she wanted to say about the horses, Debbie was happy to listen to. Now she said, "Okay, I'm going to do it again, but you go down the hill and wait on the flat part." Debbie turned Rufus and went down at a walk while Fiona went up at a canter. By the time Debbie had Rufus right in the middle of the flat part, Fiona was waiting by the fence, pointed downward. She waved. Fiona clapped her legs against Prince's sides, and he started to canter. Fiona leaned back, and then she was squatting, and then Prince was galloping right at Debbie and Rufus. Fiona stood up. The pony's ears pricked. Debbie took hold of both his mane and the rope, bit her lips. She knew that she had to sit tight. Prince kept coming. Fiona kept standing, her knees slightly bent, holding the rope with both hands. Maybe she had decided she was going too fast to jump off. But she didn't look scared. She looked surprised and excited. They came on. Debbie had no idea what Rufus would do. The hoofbeats sounded loud to her, even though they were muffled by the grass and the dirt, and Prince looked enormous. They came on. Debbie tightened her legs around Rufus's fat sides. She could see Fiona's mouth open as she raised her right hand and straightened her shoulders, still standing on Prince's back. Debbie's heart was pounding. The last moment, Rufus jumped to one side and Prince skipped to the other. Debbie slid but hung on. Fiona flexed like a girl in the circus and kept her balance. 2 strides later, she squatted down again with Prince still galloping, put her hands in his mane, and dropped onto his back. At the lower fence, Fiona brought him around in a big trot circle, then came back up the hill. Debbie fell forward onto Rufus's neck, her face in his bushy pony mane. She did not want to be the one to faint and fall off. She closed her eyes. Fiona was nonchalant about the whole thing by the time she and Prince got back to Debbie and Rufus. Rufus was nonchalant too, but Prince was delighted with himself. He arched his neck and picked up his feet and took deep breaths. Fiona said, "Horses are really good at knowing where they are." Then, "I'm sorry if I scared you." Debbie said, "You didn't." But for the rest of their ride, all they did was wander around the field. Fiona made Debbie trot in a circle both ways for a few minutes just to practice. And of course, when the horses were cooled out and they went in the house for a snack, Mr. Cannon was home and he said, "You girls having a good time?" Fiona shrugged. Debbie said, "Yes, I love Rufus. He's a good pony." After they looked at Fiona's latest edition of the Chronicle of the Horse, Mr. Cannon drove Debbie home while Fiona took the horses their hay. All Mom said when she walked into the house was, "Hi, honey, you look bright. The fresh air is doing you good." So that was life in 1961. No supervision. Okay, I could read a little bit of this so we can have some questions. Which do you want? Let's have a vote. How many would like me to read a little bit of this? How many would like questions? Okay, I'll read a little bit of this. I'm only going to read a couple of pages, but I'm going to read what the beginning of my favorite chapter, which is chapter 10, called Personality. This is a book where I interspersed sort of memoir-ish chapters about the horses that I had and the two that went to the racetrack with speculative chapters about how to think about horses. And this is chapter 10, it's called Personality. At one point or another, possibly while applying for a job, many Americans have taken some version of the Myers-Briggs personality test or the Keirsey temperament sorter. These systems analyze human personality by posing 4 pairs of opposites. The 4 sets of opposites yield 64 types. They attempt not to assess or even address issues of development or pathology, but rather to sort human populations in understandable terms into a manageable number of types, and then to predict what sorts of qualities each type would have and how these qualities might express themselves in the various roles that humans are asked to play. David Keirsey points out in his book, Please Understand Me, too, that attempts to define and differentiate human temperaments have a long history, and that the categories Myers-Briggs and Keirsey himself have come up with are comparable to the categories Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Shakespeare, and others came up with in their day. Above all, the Myers-Briggs categories are useful. Rather than address the idea of the individual and how he needs to fix himself, they address the world of human endeavor and ask how each type gets along and makes his or her own way. The system is based on the test taker's knowledge of himself or herself. The analytical tool these categories produce has sufficient complexity to be informative, but is simple enough for a layman to understand, and after answering 70 questions, a subject might be surprised to discover where he or she fits. The Myers-Briggs sets of opposed pairs are introverted, extroverted, intuitive, sensory, judging, perceiving, thinking, feeling. I, for example, turn out to be an extroverted, intuitive, feeling perceiver. However my brain chemistry works, however my limbic system was formed, I find myself occupying a certain human niche and feeling suited to it. The system itself makes no judgments about which of these qualities are desirable. It only attempts to describe them singly and together and to assess how many people fall into each. It is not about the psychology of the individual, but rather types of human personalities. Horses may be simpler than humans, but they have pairs of characteristics that readily express themselves in herds of horses as well as in relationship to humans. Pairs of characteristics that add up to personalities and can be used to analyze how they too might get along and make their way. I think the most obvious of these are dominant versus submissive, energetic versus phlegmatic, curious versus afraid, friendly versus aloof. Every horseman recognizes all of these traits every day, in large part because when a horse has to do a job, he expresses one or other of these traits in his approach to the job. First and foremost, a horse's behavior with his pasture mates partakes of these categories. For example, when I brought my horse, Essie, born in 1999, the 8th of my foals, from the ranch where she was born to live, with Jackie Kiss Me, number 5, Percy, and Cheerful, she showed herself right away to be submissive. She yielded to the other horses at the feed tub. Friendly, she greets me and the other horses every time she sees us, after even a short separation. Curious, On her first afternoon in the pasture, I saw her walking across the hillside, far away from the other horses, her head up and her ears pricked, apparently checking out the accommodations, and in comparison with the other thoroughbreds, a bit phlegmatic. By contrast, Jackie is dominant. He's the boss, curious. He's always inspecting whatever tools or equipment humans are using in his vicinity. Energetic, he loves to gallop full out and is hard to tire, and friendly. His ears prick at the sound of my voice, and he nickers and whinnies regularly to his associates. This combination is sometimes frightening because it can lead to unmanageability, but it is also rewarding and interesting. So then I go on and talk about how the horses, what their personality sorter is. And I made that up, but I really learned something from that when I did that. And I started approaching the horses and their training slightly differently than I had been before. I saw that, the 64 Myers-Briggs personality types, and I would say horses are as unique as people. So we can have questions now. I like questions. I think we have about 10 minutes of questions. How long are we supposed to go? I see. Okay. So we'll do questions for a while, and then we'll go out. Yes. Well, that changed over the years. When I was young, I was inspired by reading, and it made me want to write books. I was inspired by things that I learned, and I was curious and wanted to discover them. And then when I quit teaching, I became inspired by the desire to earn a living. So never underestimate the desire to earn a living as a motivator for getting to work. But I would say individual books were inspired by individual things, but the general inspiration was curiosity about something or other. Yeah. Do I think that writing the books has changed my life? Writing the books has made my life. I don't know what life it would have changed me from. I started wanting to do this when I was 21. So I don't know what the alternative would have been. But as I said in the part from 13 Ways, if you're a writer or a reader, your inner life is very real to you. And it's as real to you in a lot of ways as your exterior life. And so I guess that's the shape of my life, is thinking about stuff and doing stuff and having the two things interact with one another. Yeah. Uh-huh. Perfectionism, yeah. I was never a perfectionist. My mother would tell you that I was the farthest thing you could be from a perfectionist. I always say someday I'm going to write a book called The Blessings of ADD, because I was definitely an ADD child. And that's the kind of child who leaves her coat at school over and over and over again. And when I was in 8th grade, one of the teachers wrote on my report card, and she thought this was not a compliment. She said, she only does what she wants to do. So that's another of the blessings of ADD. But I was never a perfectionist. I was too curious and wanting to get on with it to be a perfectionist. So for me, the process is laying it out and then trying to fix it. So I try to get, one of the things I advise in 13 Ways is get through the rough draft. Just get to the end. And then come back, because there's a perfectionist part of you that's saying while you're writing, oh, this isn't good enough, but that part of you doesn't know what it's talking about. So your writer self gets to the end of the first draft. And then your reader self, which is much more experienced than your writer self, then you come back, 2 weeks later, 2 months later, whatever, and you read through it, and your reader self is a much better judge of what should be in there and what shouldn't be in there than your writer self. So eventually, if you have a long career, these become habits that you have. But you want to develop good habits, and good habits are, I would define as keeping at it, be self-forgiving, but don't give up. So stick with it. If you get bored, I talk about this in 13 ways too. If you get bored with some project, then there's a reason why you're bored with that project. And there's usually the handful of reasons are fairly limited. And one of them is you don't know what you're talking about. So go do some research. And then that will wake you up again. So 13 ways is pretty practical in its organization and its way of going about things. Yes, in the back.
You mentioned that you had a love of Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle is pretty much different than Sherlock Holmes. If you had to choose one of your works to get known for, which one would it be?
I haven't published it yet. Well, it would depend on whether I wanted the funny side of me to be known, so that might be Moo or Horse Heaven, or the sort of weird side, so that might be the Greenlanders. I don't know. I can't choose. So maybe I'll go home and start one tomorrow. Somebody on this side, yeah. I don't know. I taught for a long time and I enjoyed it, but by the time I stopped, I was pretty tired of it, so I didn't miss it. But then I'd let the UC Riverside talk me into coming back. So I'm going to go back to teaching. So if I come back here next year, I'll tell you. Yeah. In general? That I have? Uh-huh. Well, they all revolve around self-doubt, I would say. Especially for a novelist. I think poets, and you poets can correct me, but it seems to me that they can allow for a little bit of perfectionism. But novelists, the thing that if something stops them, then they're not going to get all the work that they need to do done. Novelist is more of a tortoise than a hare. And one of the things I love about the novel is that great novelists are incredibly various. So they can be prolific and a tad sloppy, like Anthony Trollope, or they can be not very prolific and very perfectionist, like James Joyce, or they can be anywhere along the continuum of fun or not fun, sad, happy. So all bad habits are what stop you, and all good habits are what keep you going. So the person you are is going to determine what your bad habits are. So I think for example, Anthony Trollope in his autobiography, he revealed what he thought his bad habits were, and it sank his reputation for a couple of generations until readers came back to him and said, wow, this is way better than we thought, and way better than he thought. So maybe the worst habit you can have is to talk about yourself in a negative way. I don't know. We'll see. But as far as producing, just produce. Do what you have to produce. I wouldn't say becoming an alcoholic is a good way, but, you know, try candy first, you know. Anybody else? One last question, yeah. Where do I look to do research? Well, that's really changed over the years. When I worked at a university, I went to the library all the time. And then when I moved away from the university life, I still went to libraries, but you know, I would find books or use bookstores or stuff like that. But then the internet, here came the internet, here came Wikipedia, here came all this information that's now online. So you can really find a lot of information. So one of my big sources is probably the New York Times archive, you know, for information about when things were happening and what was happening and what people thought about it at that time. And then that would lead me to finding books or something that would build on what I learned in the New York Times. I love Wikipedia, and I don't care if it's not quite accurate, because characters in novels don't have to be accurate. If they're too accurate, they don't sound normal. So Wikipedia is really good for novelists. But there's so many online resources now, it really depends on your subject. When I was doing the World War II part of Some Luck, there's tons of memoirs from World War II, so that was a good resource. When I was writing The All True Travels and Adventures of Liddy Newton, which takes place in Kansas during the election year of 1956, because it was an election year, there were all these correspondents, even from, say, England, out in Kansas writing like mad about all the insanity that was going on there. So there are plenty of resources too. And also memoirs of people. You know, Kansas was a scam. Kansas started out as a scam. That once they decided to allow settlers in, then all these brochures kept getting sent around and flyers kept getting sent around saying that Kansas was a paradise, that flowers were in bloom all year round, and the soil was perfect, and the trees were perfect, and the weather was perfect, you know. And so people, and the land was cheap. How could this be true? You know, this is the American way, right? Just like Southern California, where they put oranges on the Joshua trees for the passing tourists. So people would make their way to Kansas and realize, no, the weather's terrible, there's nothing to eat, you know. And so, but because it was a scam, there was plenty of stuff written about it at the time. So there were plenty of primary sources. There's always something. When I wrote The Greenlanders, there was a lot of archaeological stuff from the 1930s that had been done by Danish archaeologists and then preserved. And then, lo and behold, oddly enough, who should be now a Greenland archaeologist but a guy that I had known on an archaeological dig at Winchester Cathedral in England in 1972. I said, "Are you kidding me? You do Greenland now?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "You want to read my novel?" He said, "Sure." So something turns up. There's stuff out there. Okay, well, thank you very much. You've been a great audience. I really appreciate it. Is that okay?
Yeah, that was great. Good. Thank you so much, Jane. So there are books available for sale out in the lobby, and Jane is happy to sign.
Yeah.
And two things, Visible Vixens, if you're here for Visible Vixens, Caroline McDonald has the sheet, and she is waving her hand. She's in blue. She's right there. So check in with her. And if my students could check in with me, that would be great. So thank you, guys.